Blaxploitation was a revolutionary film genre that targeted and developed Hollywood's African-American audience in the 1970s. Blaxploitation used an exchange of black themes and characters to save Hollywood's fiscal crisis, explored negative and recurrent stereotypes, and, as a result, encountered outrage from the African-American community. Since the creation of Uncle Tom and Zip Coon in 1820, African Americans have been abused, poked fun of, and manipulated in media for white entertainment. Hollywood's first feature-length film, The Birth of a Nation, built the foundation of black men as simple-minded, sex-driven creatures, a perception that resonated throughout the development of race movies in the 1920s. From then on, the African American role in film can be seen evolving in every decade. In the 1930s, black characters were subservient housemates and helpers. In the 40s, blacks were reduced to entertaining cameo roles. The 50s more commonly included black actors, now in more complex roles. As the 60s rolled along, the nation was swept up in the civil rights movement, and racial tensions were reflected on screen. By the close of the decade, any harmony Hollywood had developed between its black and white characters was replaced with a new, unorthodox genre, one that celebrated blacks as individuals from white society, and one that defied all previous stereotypes. Blaxploitation. In the 70s, what shifted Hollywood's attention towards a black audience was not sympathy, but debt. Across the country, television had become increasingly popular. The white population, those who could afford televisions, moved to the suburbs, and the black population settled in cities. Along with this change, only 1 in 6 films were making a profit by the late 60s, and the movie-going audience suffered a decline from 80 million Americans a week in 1946 to 17.5 million in 1971. Hollywood's success no longer rested in the hands of white ticket buyers, but was passed along to urban black youth, who represented more than 30% of the box office sales in major cities. Through an exchange of black-oriented movies, Hollywood had turned to blaxploitation as a ladder out of its financial rut. By 1972, about a fourth of Hollywood's planned film production was black-oriented, as opposed to less than 3% of films released in 1970. The inception of blaxploitation is credited mostly to Gordon Parks' Shaft and Melvin Van Peebles' Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, both released in 1971. These were huge commercial successes. The settings, the characters, and the issues were relatable to urban blacks, and these movies were not softened for a white audience, but catered only to African Americans. Suddenly, black people were swarming national movie theaters. When Hollywood recognized the potential of the African American market, it released a sudden wave of black cinema. These films were low quality and shot on small budgets because the main purpose was suddenly not to entertain whites, but simply to make money. Despite the quality, top films grossed millions of dollars, and with blacks providing $110 million of film revenue by 1972, blaxploitation had certainly become Hollywood's goldmine. Although sales were high, many African Americans were dissatisfied with the genre's poor representation. Immediately, African American films found themselves exploring an excess of explicit and exaggerated stereotypes.
There's usually a ghetto. It's usually some form of vigilante justice against a criminal, but there are your stereotypical criminals in the film. There's usually a drug dealer, a pimp, a prostitute. They focus primarily on these criminal elements in the black community. To put every one of the films in the ghetto, to have all these criminals and have this criminal subculture, I think it does more harm than good when, particularly among the wider white audience, many of whom had never seen African Americans depicted in any real substantial way. It sort of reinforced some stereotypes about the criminal black man.
There was really this, such a need to sort of depict, black men as, as strong, as powerful, as in control and victorious. But often that depiction came at, the price of black women and black women's agency.
Man, all bitches are the same, just like my hoes, I keep them broke. Wake up one morning with some money, the subject to go crazy.
And it was an attempt to depict black women, and I think on some level they were successful in very new and different ways, particularly with a certain amount of strength.
I better warn you, I got a black belt in karate. So why don't you get out of here quietly? You still got some teeth left in that ugly face. And I got my black belt in bar stool.
At the same time, the women often did it through their sexuality.
You want me to crawl?
What are you doing? Put that down.
You want to spit on me and make me crawl?
Violence and sexuality are the two of the main themes in these films, and it does perpetuate the notion that African American people are violent and overly sexed. These are sort of like the base emotions that have been ascribed to African Americans by whites.
Black audiences began to sense that shift when you no longer had what they thought, at the time felt like black control. They were largely white directors, and so the characters, which, people always represented, they were little, that there were some stereotypes, but they were okay, they were acceptable. At their beginning, just where they became so extreme. Like I said, the plot, the subject matter, the characterizations were so one-dimensional, and people began to say, well, we always say, okay, we're seeing the same thing over and over again, and we're tired of it.
Almost immediately, Blaxploitation encountered a swarm of public outrage. By 1972, newspapers reported how quickly stereotypes had formed and how often black audiences left disappointed. Many black people were deeply insulted and demanded proper representation, including national organizations like the NAACP and CORE.
In 72, they were already criticizing the films. I think it finally reached sort of the masses of African Americans, and they began to reject them.
Other genres of films and things, they began to, make money again, so they were no longer felt the need to make these films as they once did. But again, people saying, we've seen this enough, we want to see different depictions. So black audiences stopped supporting the films.
Blaxploitation used an exchange of black themes and characters to rescue Hollywood from its financial rut, explored new and degrading African American cliches, and encountered resistance from its black viewership. Despite the criticisms, Blaxploitation gave power to the black community. The movies depicted men and women who no longer suffered under white supremacy, but were rebellious, passionate, and successful.
This was one of the first times that African American youth had those representations, saw those representations, and saw these characters in charge, in control, as the hero, even if it was a pimp or a prostitute, or whether it was poverty or whatever was going on in the film. These issues had never really been displayed in an American and Hollywood film.
The frustration born from blaxploitation, stereotyping, and degradation once more created the need for better depictions of African Americans. However, its three-dimensional portrayals of black protagonists, its focus on black issues, and its celebration of black identity were essential steps to developing the black image in later years. Soon, many filmmakers furthered the genre's advancement. Black-oriented movies stopped exaggerating its characters and storylines and instead displayed conventional portrayals of black life. Black people were shown more realistically than they had been in the past, now dealing in depth with themes like relationships, education, and assimilation. Not only did black movies become more progressive in the 80s and 90s, but they began to touch on African American history, providing a look back from the black perspective. As we entered the 2000s, film and television stars began to depict positive and multifaceted black characters, although the industry and society have a long way to go. The diversity in movies and television today, like blaxploitation, is just another step in the advancement of African Americans on screen.
2 bags, please, for a generous fee. Make your world what you want it to be. Got a woman I love desperately. Wanna give her something better than me. Been told I can't be nothing else. Just a hustler in spite of myself. I know